Am I audible? Yes. Okay, excellent. Just a few housekeeping things. Please drink water. We've been told that there is no air conditioning system in the lecture theatre at this time, hence the cross breeze we're attempting. And also there will be photography at this event. If that's something that you'd prefer not to be in, just come and let us know before or after, or give Kelly a wave, and we can make sure you're not in anything you don't want to be. So I'd like to welcome you here. Welcome, fellow thinkers, feminist killjoys, complainers and agitators. This lecture is part of the Feminist Thinking Seminar series, which is organised by the Master Students of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies course. Our series goal is not to decide what feminist thinking is, but rather what it could be. We invite you to attend our other talks, which explore questions in trans, queer, feminist and race studies. And to be very clear, we unequivocally welcome trans and non-binary friends, activists and scholars. There would be no feminism today without the work of trans leaders, and we want no part in a feminism that does not include our friends and loved ones. Our thanks to the cohort who've done a lot of work for this event and all of our events so far, our wonderful co-conveners and tutors of our master's program, the Intersectional Humanities Research Hub at Torch. Torch is the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities for its support of this event, and also the English faculty for all of your work co-hosting this event. Thank you so much. It is very hard to introduce a person who needs no introduction, and I think for us baby feminist academics, you could say that we stand in Sara Ahmed's shadow and her towering, respected presence in the realm of feminist theory. Being in the shadow, though, for those of us who grew up in warmer climates, is not necessarily a bad thing. The shadow is a respite from burning out. The shadow caster takes the heat. The shade is a place to regroup and to rest. Sara Ahmed's work gives us this shade, and it throws shade, and in doing so it speaks directly to us and our lived experience. It is particularly timely to have Sara here to deliver her lecture, Changing Institutions, Complaint, Common Sense, and Other Lessons in Legacy. We are students of this institution and also advocates and activists in our own right. Our desires share common themes: mutual respect, self-determination, the ability to live safely. When facing an institution, we are often told that our worries are too small, our views hysterical, our attitude willful. Of the 10,000 chairs in Oxford's libraries, only 3 of them have headrests. 2 are in the law library, 1 broken, 1 missing, and the other is in the English library in a staff member's office. You need a headrest to sit without pain. You don't study law or English. You ask for a chair in the library where your peers study, in October, and it's now May. You study on the floor of your room. A senior staff member kisses you on the cheek and holds your hand after group meetings. He says his wife is Thai. You are not Thai. You're also not his wife. You tell HR, and they say they'll deliver diversity training to his area. A man in the car backs into a crowd of Asian tourists. You file a report to the police. You are told no charges will be pressed because no one was hurt. You let the university know that this is why you were late. You were filing a police report. You're told, I can't believe this would happen in this day and age. Disbelief. You were told, oh, people in that town are so backwards. Dismissal. You have a security interview for an office job. They ask you about your sexuality, your sexual habits, your previous partners. You're told it's because you might be a blackmail risk because you are gay. You can't tell anyone, not even your wife. To do so might lose you your job. There are no people of colour on your teaching staff. It makes you wonder what your future in academia looks like. You hear at the end of a Teams call that the staff think you have left. These kids don't know how good they've got it. And so you file a complaint, you walk beside another student, you raise an issue, you erect a tent. You're told again and again, in this day and age, I can't believe that's still happening. Or you're met with silence. Your anti-racism is wokeism. Your stance against transphobia is identity politics. You don't show enough respect for the legacy of the institution, and you are not sufficiently grateful to be here. Your emotion makes you a snowflake, though you suspect that you are not the fragile one. The voice of institutional power too often becomes our own internal voice, a panopticon for self-censorship. Trying to change seemingly immovable institutions is exhausting, isolating work. Sara's writing, including in her most recent book, The Feminist Killjoy Handbook, helps to give shape to what can feel like a hot mess. And most importantly, in its solidarity, her work makes us feel a part of something and less alone. Please join me in welcoming Sara Ahmed.
So much for that beautiful introduction, and to all the students on the Women, Gender and Sexuality course. It was a joy to speak to you today and to know that you're out there doing your thing. I dedicate this lecture to everyone here fighting against institutional violence and everyone fighting for a free Palestine. Changing institutions. In one way or another, over a long period of time, I've been listening to people's stories about trying to change institutions. How I came to listen to these stories is another story. So let me begin here. When I first became Director of Women's Studies back in the year 2000, I began to attend more university committees. I was almost always the only person of colour at these meetings. In one, a professor said you could not do anything about the whiteness of the university because it was, quote, a matter of geography. In another, the dean said, but race is too difficult to deal with. I knew enough to know I would become the problem if I said anything, and I did not yet have the confidence to do that. So after that second meeting, I sent the dean an email saying, racism is reproduced by treating race as too difficult to deal with. I wrote about how the whiteness of the university was an achievement. In response to this letter, which we could call an informal complaint, the dean put me forward to become a member of the university's newly formed race equality group. Complaints can lead us to take on institutional roles that are about, or at least appear to be about, institutional change. Whatever this role was about, I learnt so much from it because it's how I ended up in conversation with diversity practitioners. It was these conversations that led me, a humanities scholar by training, used to reading texts, not talking to people, although these distinctions don't hold, to decide to undertake empirical research. So, between 2001 and 2004, I conducted interviews with diversity practitioners who'd been appointed to institutionalise commitments to diversity. And I shared this research in my 2012 book, On Being Included. There it is. It remains interesting to me that some of the strongest critiques of institutions I've heard have come from diversity practitioners who, in the UK, as I'm sure you know, are usually administrators. Practitioners tasked by institutions to bring about change within them collect more and more evidence of the resistance to change. So one practitioner described diversity as a big shiny apple. It all looks wonderful, but the inequalities are not being addressed. This critique of diversity as a way of appearing is also a critique of what institutions are not doing. She described her job thus: it's a banging your head against the brick wall job. So a job description becomes a wall description. when the wall keeps its place, it's you that gets sore. And what happens to the wall? All you seem to have done is scratch the surface. And this is what doing diversity work often feels like, scratching the surface or scratching at the surface. The year after On Being Included came out, I was called to another meeting at another university with students who'd made a collective complaint about sexual harassment. And I worked with these students over 3 years. I became a feminist ear, giving students somewhere to go with their complaints. And I began to hear more and more about what had gone on before, missing records, missing persons, those who had left because they could not take it. They should not have to take it. It was a profoundly shattering experience. It was not that I had believed that my university was progressive before. I was, after all, a woman of colour scholar, a killjoy at work, offering critiques of diversity, organising conferences on racism and sexism. But I came to realise that even that work had just skimmed the surface, and that even having the space to do that work was conditional on not saying or doing other things, not speaking out too loudly about sexual harassment at the university. So I left that post. And since I left my post in 2016, I've been talking to many students and academics about their experiences of making complaints, which I shared in my 2021 book, Complaint! Making a complaint can be a lot like diversity work. The harder it is to get through, the more you have to do. So one student called her complaint an energy zapper. I was rather reminded in the bunny, in the old advert for Duracell batteries. When the battery lasts longer, the bunny spends longer going round and round. So in a way, exhaustion is another wall story, and in that wall, a weary wisdom. We learn so much about institutions from how our complaints are stopped by them. Complaints are often stopped, they don't have anywhere to go, through the use of warnings, and I will share such stories in due course. But they can also be stopped by a nod or a yes. So one early career lecturer described this weird magical thing that happens when you speak to people in management, when you go in there and you're kind of ready for it, and you're really fired up, and you kind of put your complaint, your case, your story to the person, and then you sort of leave as if a spell has been cast, leave feeling like, okay, something might happen. And that kind of wears off a few hours later, and you think, oh my gosh, it's like a sleight of hands, almost like a trick. You feel tricked. A yes as a hand trick, creating the impression that something will be done without doing it, so that the person who makes the complaint stops fighting for it. Diversity too can be that hand trick, that yes, let's do this, which means that an institutional expression of a will to change can be another method for resisting it. And yet today, diversity is increasingly represented as forced change, as an ideological imposition, or as compelled speech. So in the UK, the most elite white institutions are now described as woke on the basis of the existence of diversity programs and equality initiatives designed to make them less so, less elite, less white. The current government has recently appointed a new minister with the unofficial title of Common Sense Czar, who will be tackling the scourge of workery and who is against LGBTQIA+ education as well as diversity training. Common sense is used to suggest that those who are trying to change institutions are not only damaging legacy, but that they are alienated from reality. And it's this connection between legacy and reality that I want to explore today by treating common sense and complaint as different vantage points, different lessons on the same objects. So I'll be drawing from a book I'm completing now called A Complainer's Handbook, which follows on from the Feminist Killjoy Handbook. And these are my first trade books, and I've written them in part as I'm no longer working at a university, and I wanted to reach audiences without the university as a go-between. But I am still a killjoy at work, working on institutions and working with those who are trying to change them. So in a complainer's handbook, I pull out the significance of my research on diversity and complaint for an understanding of institutional power and institutional change. So I'm going to begin with common sense and its objects. So common sense is appealed to not just as a legacy, but as a national legacy, what we have been bequeathed from the past in the form of a faculty. So during the COVID pandemic, government officials, including the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, regularly referred to British common sense, sometimes describing it as good and old, other times as solid, as what we should use in making our own judgments about what to do, whether to mask or not mask, where to go, where not to go. A rather convenient way, no doubt, of displacing responsibility from government to individual. This idea of good old British common sense is an old idea, if not a good one. As historian Sophie Rosenfeld notes, by the 1720s, good old English or British common sense had become a recognisable entity. Rosenfeld also notes that giving a history of common sense is difficult, and that difficulty is a starting point for so much critical work. She says, the historicity of our seemingly timeless natural common sense was also in the 1970s and 1980s, a frequent theme of cultural theorists from Roland Barthes to Stuart Hall. And in my project, it's been a joy to go back and look over some of that work that I read when I was an undergraduate student. So take Stuart Hall's description of what passes as common sense, how it feels as if it has always been there, the sedimented bedrock wisdom of the race. Common sense as a feeling of longevity, of what hangs around or goes without saying. So that a history of common sense is hard to give is a sign of its historical effectiveness. So one way of giving that history is to consider the status of the objects that are used to exemplify it. I've always been fascinated by object examples, so in my book, Queer Phenomenology, I caught sight of the table in Husserl's philosophy and have since been following tables around rather obsessively. And tables are everywhere in the literatures on common sense. In my book on the uses of use, What's the Use?, I noticed how the blacksmith's strong arm was used to exemplify the naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's law of use and disuse without actually being used by Lamarck. So the blacksmith's strong arm became Lamarckian without being used by Lamarck. When the references to that blacksmith's strong arm became substantial, the quality of substantial seemed to transfer to the thing itself. Common sense, too, often points to things. So the analytical philosopher G.E. Moore argued that he could not be more persuaded by sceptical questions about the existence of external reality than he could by common sense. And in defending common sense, he makes use of his own hand, both in his paper, In Defense of Common Sense, and then in a lecture, Proof of an External World. And it's in the lecture that Moore's hand acquires an exemplary status. He asks the question, how can you prove the existence of an external world? And the hand is an answer. By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, here is another. That gesture is not just pointing to something, what should be obvious to someone with common sense. It is a refutation of something or somebody else. The hand provides evidence of the folly of skepticism, becoming, in this sense, a tool. Note here how the word certain is attached not to the hand itself, but the gesture. Perhaps recalling the blacksmith's strong arm, what the hand is doing is partly that we can point to it or make reference to it, the hand as a reference point. So I became interested in Moore's hand and what he was doing with it after reading the preface of a book on conservative common sense written by Michael Nazir Ali. And this book was produced by a new lobby group in the UK called the Common Sense Group, who describe themselves as the institutional custodians of history and heritage. How does Ali define common sense in his preface? Common sense came simply to mean good judgment, which is not easily swayed by intellectual or cultural fads and takes a realistic view of ourselves and what is around us. In philosophy, this view was vigorously defended by the analytical philosopher G.E. Moore, who held that when a philosophical view is in conflict with common sense, it is more likely that the view was in error rather than that common sense had gone astray. He gave the example of knowing that his hand existed and was his as being more certain than any sceptical questions to show that such was not the case. Moore's argument can, of course, be legitimately extended to our knowledge of our body as a whole and to the different parts of it and their purpose. It could also be extended to our knowledge of our relationships, their meaning and purpose, and indeed to the social structures and institutions which provide coherence and stability to the social order. So Ali makes use of Moore's hand, moving from the philosopher's certainty that his hand existed and was his, in Ali's terms, to his own certainty about the nature of bodies and their purposes to social structures and institutions. So that quality of certainty is moved from an object that is relatively near and proximate to that which is more complex and distant. Common sense conservatism speaks of the stability of social institutions insofar as they are extensions of my hand or his hand. Moore employs his hand as a defense against the skeptics. Ali then re-employs Moore's hand as a defense against the woke. So throughout the book, there are 62 references to woke, which I've listed for you, as they make quite... So the references to woke have become substantial. So here, when the references to woke are substantial, that quality of substance transfers to the hand as that which could be missing or go missing. Rosenfeld herself notes that common sense really only comes out of the shadows and draws attention to itself at moments of perceived crisis or collapsing consensus. So that hand points to a crisis rather than resolving it. The hand embodies not only what was there, but what should be there or might not be there. It is that loss of the hand, potential or actual, that makes that certain gesture of pointing to it necessary. So let's see that gesture. One author in this book writes, Britain is under attack, not in a physical sense, but in a philosophical, ideological, and historical sense. Our heritage is under a direct assault. The very sense of what it is to be British has been called into question. Institutions have been undermined. The reputation of key figures in our country's history have been traduced. This gives huge power to activists and forces the leaders of organisations to fight endless fires of grievance, stifling freedom, embittering the workplace, and sowing division. So woke here functions as what you might call a hegemonic complaint or a meta complaint or perhaps a counter complaint, a complaint about complaints, those minor grievances made by mischievous minorities. History and culture are then treated as if they reside in the things themselves, a positive quality, which is how political actions such as calling for the removal of the statues of slave owners or eugenicists can and will be framed as cancelling history rather than challenging a view of it. So common sense conservatism not only treats culture and history as unchanging, but change as strange, as being imposed by strangers, those who are not us, outsiders. Language, too, is treated as unchanging. The same author writes, words that have been universally understood for millennia, such as man and woman, are now emotionally charged and dangerous. Another conservative politician, he's since become British Prime Minister, stated, "We want to confront this left-handed culture that seems to want to cancel our history, our values, our women." So that argument that women are being cancelled, expressed with an old sexist possessive, our women, is drawing loosely from the gender-critical argument that the term gender has replaced sex. So if you talk about pregnant people, we cannot talk about women. So common sense then treats sex itself rather like Moore's hand, that of which we can be certain. Judith Butler, in their important critique of the anti-gender movement, comments on its reliance on common sense. A table appears here. There is a pounding on the table that goes along with the... like that. I wasn't expecting to do that. There's a pounding on the table that goes along with the insistent repetition of the claim of purely biological differences, as if pounding and repetition makes it so. The hand that pounds the table becomes an arm that wrestles. Gender-critical feminist Kathleen Stock has made 3 references to arm wrestles as demonstrating the facts of the matter. In fact, making it very, very clear there are 2 sexes and that you cannot change sex. So here are some references to arm wrestles, one from social media, one from a lecture, and one from a published article. I'm 6 foot tall and weigh slightly more than my 6 foot 17-year-old testosterone-fueled son, and I'm telling you, it's not me who wins the family arm wrestling competitions. Ultimately, reality hits you in the face. I can think of myself as a man as much as I like, but ultimately, I'm not going to be able to arm wrestle you very successfully. Get your trans activist troublemaker away from their screen or phone and into the great outdoors. Inhibit the flow of crazy pronouncements flying into innocent minds via LGBT organisations and blue tick accounts on Twitter. Encourage them instead to run around, take their shoes off and paddle, get muddy and out of breath, and generally to reconnect with their physical bodies and the natural world. And if a member of the opposite sex is around, why not encourage them to arm wrestle each other, have a fight contest? They both might learn something interesting. So the arm wrestle here is treated as evidence of the truth of sex as bodily difference, or even as opposition, opposite sexes, as what cannot be changed or transcended. Indeed, the very idea that sex can be changed is treated as alienation, not only from one's own physical body, but from the natural world and from reality as such. So I'm going to return to how some of us might offer alternative feminist views of reality because we are out of breath, because our bodies teach us that materiality, and with it restriction, and with it limits, are not outside of history. So this idea that biological sex is common sense has led to increasingly banal statements, as I'm sure you're aware. So, for example, the British Prime Minister has stated, "A man is a man and a woman is a woman, that's just common sense." Where man is the answer to the question of what is a man, the answer is there is no question. But think of how little is being learnt or said here. If I was to say to you, a tree is a tree, I would not be telling you anything about trees. So common sense removes so much by removing the question of what's what and who's who. Questions themselves become queer in the sense of odd, also out of place. We could think here of the work of the sociologist Harold Garfinkel, for whom common sense is a social but also practical activity. It's what is being accomplished. He used, as an ethnomethodologist, a method he calls breaching experiments, where a student, for example, asked, "What do you mean by a flat tire?" and he shows how that question is treated as hostile. What do you mean by asking, what do you mean? So questions about meaning can pull someone away from the scene of an action, from what is being accomplished, fixing a problem that needs to be fixed. The point is not that this is a crazy question, in quote marks, because the meaning of the words is self-evident or obvious. Not at all. The point is that to be in the middle of a project is to suspend or to bracket certain questions about the meaning of the words that we are using to describe what it is that we are doing. So the questioner who refuses to put those questions in brackets becomes a stranger getting in the way of an accomplishment. This second section is called Institutions as Legacy Projects. So the hand of common sense conservatism is extended as certainty from what is mine to social institutions. So society matters here, but as my or his possession. In the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to explore this extension not as an act of cognition, but rather as an institutional mechanism. That hand, that certain gesture, will come up in another way. In other words, I want to give that hand a history, a hand as having a hand in things, how they come to be made. So let's consider Hannah Arendt's discussion of common sense in The Life of the Mind. Arendt writes, "In a world of appearances filled with error and semblance, reality is guaranteed by this threefold commonness. The five senses, utterly different from each other, have the same object in common, members of the same species have the same context in common, that endows every single object with its particular meaning, and all other sense-endowed beings, though perceiving this object from utterly different perspectives, agree on its identity. Out of this threefold commonness arises the sensation of reality." And for Arendt here you can see that pluralism is also about partiality. More of us can see the object from different sides. So other sense-endowed beings, what is she referring to here? One commentator suggests that other sense-endowed beings might be agreeable in the following way. A bird may not understand why humans make tables, but by actually sitting on it, the bird confirms the table's reality. So Arendt's description is phenomenologically rich, and it's building from a classical conception of common sense as a sixth sense. It certainly points to the complexity of common sense. So what is shared is not just the object nor the context, but also the agreement that the object, seen from different perspectives, is the same thing. So in my common sense project, which I'm sort of beginning, so you're with me at a very early stage, I hope to offer a more genealogical account of institutions themselves, how they acquire the status of an object whose identity must be agreed in some way, and how particular objects, from hands to tables, come to hold that agreement. So consider how becoming a member of an organisation or a community, you might be required to treat the legacy of that organisation as reality, as what is being handed down to you. I think of a conversation I had with a woman of colour academic about why she did not make the complaints that she had about sexism and racism. In explaining why she didn't make these complaints, she offers a really sharp description of the culture of her institution. There's an agreement between people not to rock the boat. People would talk about the institution as a kind of legacy project and would imply that you just didn't understand how the institution was formed. The implication was that you have to be respectful of how this place was organised and what its traditions were, essentially. And if you were not abiding by that, it was because you had not been there for 10 years. So the culture of her institution is that you don't complain about the culture of the institution. To complain will be to provide evidence that you've not been in the institution long enough to understand it, to respect it, how it's organised, its traditions. So the complainers will be those who have not yet internalised the norms of the institution, those for whom the project of the institution has not yet become their own. This is why even to indicate that you might complain is to be given a lesson in legacy. I talked to a postgraduate student who was sexually harassed by her supervisor. So she goes to the office responsible for handling complaints at her university. And they were like, you can file a complaint, but he's really well loved by the university. He has a strong publication record. You're going to go through all of this emotional torment. It was even proposed that he could countersue me for defamation of character. The line was essentially, you can do this, but why would you? In being warned not to complain, she met with a set of beliefs that I've been calling institutional fatalism, statements about what institutions are like, what they will be, who they will and will not love, who they will and will not protect. So in the end, she did not file a formal complaint because she knew what she was being told, that she wouldn't get anywhere, that it wouldn't get anywhere because he was going somewhere. She was also being told what she needed to do or not do to get somewhere. That hand of common sense, remember that certain gesture, becomes the hand of correction telling you, don't go that way, go this way, that way is the wrong way to go, the way that would stop you getting what you want to get. So a well-used definition of common sense is sound and practical judgment. It might seem really obvious that it's not practical to complain about your supervisor. Complaints are impractical. They are made impractical. So I talked to an MA student who was considering whether to make a complaint about the conduct of the most senior professor in her department. She had already made a complaint informally about the syllabus. It was only white men until week 10. And then she told him she would like to write her essay on gender and race. And he replied, if you write on those fucking topics, you are going to fucking fail my course. You haven't fucking understood anything I've been talking about if you think those are the correct questions for this course. That hand can be a no, a stop sign, a warning. So she tells the MA convener that she is going to go ahead with the complaint. And she receives another warning. Be careful, he is an important man. Perhaps he is a legacy, or perhaps he has one. So that warning is both a judgment about who is important, as well as a direction. It's saying, don't go there, because he could do that. She went there, and he did that. In her terms, she sacrificed the references, and in reference to the prospect of doing a PhD, she said, that door is closed. That door is closed. References can be doors, how some are stopped from progressing. So that door is closed. She will not be there. She is not here, bringing to the institution what she might have brought to it, including a critical questioning of an important man and his legacies. She's warned to be careful. So maybe being careful is about learning to eliminate that critical attitude from ourselves, or at least disguising it, perhaps by turning it into an elegant argument in an essay that only a few people will read. I've talked to many people who've been advised not to complain, not to be too critical of the institution until later, when they were more established. The problem with later is that it usually comes too late, by which I mean not at all. By the time some have been given permission to be critical of the institution, they seem to lose the capacity or will to do so. So warnings about complaint are part of a cluster of speech acts that we might call career advice. You are being told what you should do and not do to go further. So you might be told not to complain because you need a reference from an important man, or you might be told to refer to an important man in that elegant essay. The more a path is used, the more a path is used. The more he is cited, the more he is cited. He is cited because he's important. Because he is important, he is cited. This is why it's important to say here that the path that has been cleared is not just a path that clears his way, but also the path that could clear the way for others to follow him would be to have a clearer route through. And that's why common sense doesn't just create a class of subjects, those for whom the obvious is obvious, but also objects, institutional landscapes, paths or common reference points, what or who is more or less important, bigger or smaller, nearer or further away, and even more or less real. I think it can be very hard to separate good practice, showing, for example, an appreciation of the important work that's being done in a given field, from what we might call, following Sarah Franklin, sexism as a means of reproduction, where some paths are made wrong, others right. Franklin's case study is an essay of hers that she wrote when she was a student, marked by Professor P, whose handwritten annotations turn it, in Franklin's terms, into a bloody document. Slovenly is one of the words used by Professor P. Dreadful, another in black. I did not like this at all, in capitals. The word hand can also mean power, control, and possession, which is said to derive from the notion of grip or hold. So you can see that hand at work, the grip on a pen on a person, saying, this is wrong, and so are you. So perhaps that's why we tell other stories about hands, not because they guarantee reality, but because of how they are used possessively. So we do what we can to keep loosening that grip. In my book, Living a Feminist Life, I adopted a citational policy not to cite any white men. Please note, I understood this as an experiment, not an instruction, and it is, of course, a rather blunt policy. Sometimes you need a blunt policy to break a habit. So one time I gave a lecture on brick walls, racism, and other hard histories. It was just after the book came out, so I had copies of it with me. A white man professor was in the audience. He probably was a very important man too. So he was flicking through the book during the lecture. You know, he's flicking the pages quite loudly. And then he was also sighing, also quite loudly. Of course, he asked the first question, and then he referred to page 15, and then using his finger, that's my finger, but using his finger, pointed to that sentence, and he read it out loud. I do not cite any white men. And he said, that's troubling. And a gesture, that point. Trying not to reproduce a legacy requires often, I think, a collective effort, not least because these efforts are treated as troubling or as bad practice or even as vandalism, a willful destruction of the venerable and beautiful. When students at one London university asked for more philosophers from outside the West to be taught, they were quickly represented as cancelling white philosophers. We can't teach Kant, another report said. And decolonize the curriculum is often framed like this, as an act of vandalism, knocking off the heads of statues, snapping at the throne of the philosopher king. Snap, snap. So I talked to a woman of colour who wrote a paper for a special issue of a journal on decolonising her discipline. So she receives feedback from a white editor. The response of the editor was, needs to be toned down, not enough scholarly input to back up the claims they're making. Basically, get back in your box, and if you want to decolonise, we'll do it on our terms. Whiteness can be just as occupying of spaces when they're designated decolonial. I sometimes call this decolonial whiteness. You're told the same old things by the same old people. Tone it down, cite right, cite white, remove yourself from your text. There are so many ways we are asked to remove ourselves. She also described her experience on a diversity committee. I was on the Equality and Diversity group in the university, and as soon as I started mentioning things to do with race, they changed her portfolio of who could be on the committee, and I was dropped. Just say the word race, yes, on the diversity committee, where you might expect that word to come up sometime, and you'll be heard as complaining, as being negative or obstructive or destructive. So when she is removed, so too is that word. And in a way, so too is that work of bringing the word to the table. As a part of the work of trying to change institutions is also to create rooms in which we can do that work. I've used the term queer use to describe the effort to open institutions to those for whom they were not intended. And this is one example I've used: the birds turn a postbox into a nest. I think this is a rather happy and hopeful image, perhaps not a typical one for a killjoy to show. Mostly to queer use, to open up spaces to those for whom they were not intended, you have to do more than just turn up. In fact, we turn up and we're often told, as she was, get back in your box. We could be told that in the diversity committee or the decolonising group. So there could be another sign on the postbox that says, birds welcome. Diversity is that sign. That sign would be a non-performative, empty of force, if the postbox was still in use, because the birds would be dislodged by the letters, the nest destroyed before it could be created. All those comments needs to be toned down, not enough scholarly input. They can function like letters in the box, piling up until there's no room left, no room to breathe or to nest or to be. So this third section is called a hostile environment. When diversity is that sign, diversity is used to obscure the hostility of the environment. I've already shared stories of hostility, a hostility directed towards those who ask the wrong questions about important men and their legacies. Hostility can also be a way of occupying space, the word hostility deriving from hostilis, Latin for enemy or stranger. A hostile environment can be how some people are treated as strangers. They are told, this is not your box. The woman of colour who was told exactly this in a decolonising group said, whenever you raise something, the response is, you're not one of them. You're already not one of them, but by raising something, you reconfirm that judgment. So she knew what followed raising issues by raising issues. So one time she was involved in a collective complaint about how senior white men professors were behaving in research meetings. What I found in each of these meetings were senior men who were bullying everyone in the room. She describes how racist comments were often made, such as this one, I'm from London and London is just right for ethnic cleansing. She described how people laughed and how the laughter filled the room. These were the sorts of things being aired, she said, even the air can be occupied. So she decides to complain, to be involved in a complaint. It involved 40 people, I think, in the end, because the culture was being reproduced for new PhD students. So this is an important insight here into how conduct itself becomes culture, a kind of transmission system, like how electricity is conducted by wire. You have to complain to stop them passing down messages about how to act, how to be professors or scholars. That hand-me-down. When you're trying to stop people treating an institution as their possession, you are often treated as having a will to power. So even though the complaint was collective, they treated it as a problem with her. They treated the submission as an act of arrogance on my part. So she leaves that job. In her next job, she encountered a similar problem, but this time it was the students who complained. So they were informed that they needed to attend the research seminars. And the students wrote a letter saying they actively chose not to go to these seminars because they were designed for a handful of senior white men in the department. The professors responded. The first thing the director said is that we must defend ourselves. Perhaps these people didn't attend the sessions because they found them too intellectually challenging. It is not just that to complain is not to be respectful of the content of this or that tradition. It is that traditions often depend on a select few being given the freedom to express themselves however they wish, and specifically the freedom to be derogatory and demeaning towards those they consider subordinates. If you object to the conduct, you are perceived as weaker and as weakening. They found them too intellectually challenging. I think this is how equality policies, including dignity at work, are quickly judged as weakening an elite, the guardian of institutions and their legacies. In the words of one black woman professor, who talked to me about her complaint. This is such an astute observation. Policies are for the others. Sometimes, as we know, a hostile environment can be a policy. Yes, that was that name, sent out on a bus. A policy on immigration, go home. Racial harassment as a national policy. But mostly organisations have policies against hostile environments. So when complaints are made, they often point to these policies as if having a policy against something is evidence it does not exist. But when you try and use the policy to do something, the policy becomes like a hand trick. Suddenly it's not there. So I spoke to a woman who'd been bullied by her head department for many years, and she decided to complain eventually because her university had spent a lot of time developing new complaints and new policies. So she ended up calling them window dressing and said the policies are not meant. So she describes one incident. So he started to yell, and I stood up. You go out of the office, and then to the left is a little passageway to the door. So I went up to the front door, and it has two locks that you have to turn in two different directions. And I had all my bags on me, and then up behind me came a pair of hands and pulled my hands off the lock. He sort of wrapped his arm around me, so I was constrained with my arms by my sides. I thought, if I try to go to the front door again, he may grab me again. So the hands that come up, pulling her hands off the lock becoming a hand, the hand a lock. What stops her from getting out? She did get out, but it was hard. So she submits a formal complaint, and he is suspended during an inquiry, but then he is cleared of any wrongdoing. How? The report describes him as having a direct style of management, as if being physically rough is just a way of expressing himself. And what about the assault itself? It is described as on par with a handshake. On par equals equal. So a physical assault is turned into a friendly greeting. So the violence of the action is removed by how the violence is described. A physical assault, a friendly greeting. In fact, she is called uncollegial, and she is asked to move departments. So the hand of the institution becomes the hand of a person, and it's locked. And when that he is protected, that hand disappears, that hand trick, and with it, the force. So here, the disappearing hand, the disappearance of force, is telling us something about who the institution is for. I talked to an early career academic who made a complaint after she was not given the time that she needed to return to work after a period of extended sick leave. She is neuroatypical, and she needed time and space to return and to do her work. So she went through her university's policies with a fine-tooth comb and found that the university had failed to follow its own policies, including on management of attendance as well as dignity at work. But despite the evidence, she does not get anywhere. So she actually decided to leave both her post and, in fact, the profession. And she was told in leaving her post that she had left common sense behind. People said it made no common sense for me to leave a stable job. And in a mental health crisis assessment, if the senses don't appear to make common sense, then you are pathologized or medicated. It really has been better for me to abdicate, flee and leave with my uncommon senses intact. So perhaps then common sense might also reference how the world appears to be for those who are given room. Some cannot breathe in that room. She describes her experience of complaint thus. It was like a little bird scratching away at something, and it wasn't really having an effect. It was just really small, 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 and behind closed doors. I think people maybe feel that because of the nature of the complaint, and you're off work, so they have to be polite and not talk about it. And so much of their politeness is because they don't want to say something. And maybe it's to do with being in an institution and the way they are built. Long corridors, doors with locks on them, windows with blinds that come down. It seems to sort of imbue every part of it with a cloistered feeling. There is no air. It feels suffocating. There is no air. When you have to fight for a room, you can become conscious of what little room you have. And that complaint can acquire exteriority, becoming a thing in the world scratching away, a little bird. All your energy going into what you can do, but that barely seems to leave a trace. The smaller it becomes, the smaller you become, smaller and smaller still. But notice how the birds have returned. This time they don't land on the table, confirming its reality. They are more rather like the birds that turn the postbox into a nest, scratching away, trying to create some room in an otherwise hostile environment. So let's think again about the bird that landed on our ant's table. Does that bird have another story to tell? Could the bird itself be an invitation to think differently? Hannah Arendt suggested that if common sense gives us the sensation of reality, the activity of thinking is about losing it. Thinking can seize upon and get hold of everything real, events, objects, its own thoughts. Their realness is the only property that remains stubbornly beyond its reach. To say that some changes or potential changes are understood as crises of common sense is to suggest that they require some people to think about what they previously had not thought about. So say when people become angry because they're asked to respect other people's pronouns, or to learn to pronounce what someone once described to me as funny names, it is because they are losing not reality as such, but an unthinking relation to it. To say, this is my hand, or his hand, or our hand, is to defend an unthinking relation to the world, or what I'm tempted to call an unthinking freedom. So we can return to how the questioner is made a stranger. Sometimes all we have to do to throw everything into question is to turn up, or to progress. Heidi Mirza, a woman of colour professor, described a conversation at her inaugural lecture as professor. A white male professor leaned into me at the celebration drinks and whispered bitterly in my ear, well, they're giving chairs to anyone for anything these days. When a woman of colour becomes a chair, chairs lose their status and value. The value of some things then being dependent on the restriction on who can use them or have them or be them. This is how damaging legacy is treated as damaging reality. The chairs, the tables, the things themselves. You are not really a chair, so you've damaged the chair. A woman of colour professor can be evidence of the lost hand. She makes not just the chair be not a chair, but possibly also the institution be something other than what it is or should be. You might be told, you're not really a professor, and that not really migrates reality as hostility. You might be told your relationships are not really relationships, that your families are not really families, that you're not really from this country, that you're not really who you say you are, that you don't really belong here, that your subject is not really a proper subject. Some subjects appear more substantial, real even, because over time they've been referred to that way, rather like the blacksmith's arm, and not to be treated as real. It's how you're then made smaller or slighter or lighter or insubstantial, more easily blown away. You might be questioned then. The questioner is questioned then. Who are you? What are you? Where are you from? No, really. A trans student of colour made a complaint about sexual harassment and transphobic harassment from their supervisor, who kept asking them deeply intrusive questions about their gender and genitals. These questions were laced in the language of concern for the welfare of the student, predicated on judgments that they would be endangered if they conducted their research in their home country. So when they complain, what happens? People were just trying to evaluate whether he was right to believe that there would be some sort of physical danger to me because of my gender identity, as if to say he was right to be concerned. The same questions that led you to complain are asked because you complain. A right to be concerned, becoming you are right to be concerned. Other people might not hear the hostility of these questions because of how they are thinly masked as concern. I would describe gender-critical feminism as a thinly masked, hostile environment. I noted earlier how gender-critical feminists treat sex as real, like that hand turned even into an arm wrestle. The repeated mantra, sex is real, slides very quickly into statements about how trans people are not real, that they are deluded or disassociated, two words in very common use, from reality, dangerous because of the imposition of a requirement to treat these delusions as real. We learn in time, I think this is partly what it means to be a killjoy at work, we learn in time to diagnose what I'm calling false positives, gestures that appear to be welcoming, opening a door or a dialogue, but are not. Diversity is one such false positive. Minorities welcome, come in, come in. Just because they welcome you, it doesn't mean they expect you to turn up. Let's have a debate about sex and gender is another false positive. There might be a sign on the box, birds welcome to a debate. Are you really birds? That debate enables the posting of letters in the box, statements after statements, and more statements about trans people not being who they say they are, not being real or not being real in the same way, the right way, their way. To debate is to be required to be in proximity to those statements. Even if you were to write your letters to oppose their letters, they would end up in the same pile, dialogue as displacement, leaving you with no room to breathe, to nest, or to be. Sometimes that invitation to enter disguises who has the power to decide. A conservative think tank could use that same sign, birds welcome, as evidence that the birds of hegemony, powerful lobby, that they push their way into our box. They might write letters about the birds, how wrong it is that they've been given all these special privileges. The birds help me recognise something here. How some of us can be called powerful without even being able to get into the damn box. The point is, of course, that those who understand that box as theirs, that common sense we might call ownership, are still using the box, posting the letters, more and more letters, complaining about the woke and the snowflakes. And so we end up here, where we are, in the space of a queer inversion, the oppressors using the language of oppression, safety and harm in defence of their occupation. This is my conclusion, complaint activism. I have too many choices. So the very identification of diversity and equality as woke is an argument that change is being imposed, or that beliefs in change, that sex can be changed, or bodies, or families, or institutions, or histories, or culture are being imposed. So common sense is how the imposed nature of what some of us are trying to change is not recognised. But common sense is not just a set of beliefs that we can challenge and then be done with. Common sense is also how it's made impractical to question these beliefs. For change to be more possible, more of us need to be impractical, which means we're asking a lot of each other, as we must. Let me return to common sense conservatism. We could compare that book written to the Sewell report published in 2021. I'm sure many of you know this report. It declared there was no evidence, none at all, of institutional racism in the UK. It even asked us to see the positives in slavery. It's important to note that this report was primarily authored by black and brown British subjects. So common sense conservatism can enlist those of us who are not one of them. Perhaps you're more likely not to be stopped by institutional racism if you deny it exists. Maybe you could even be promoted. And maybe then your promotion could be used as evidence that it doesn't really exist. I call it a door deal. The door is open to some of us as long as we shut that door right behind us, shut that door on others like us, shut that door by not even thinking of ourselves as one of the others. And perhaps then you demonstrate your allegiance with the vehemence with which you shut that damn door, your hands making that gesture. So the hand that pounds the table polishes the table, polishing, making the surface smooth and shiny, removing the dust and the dirt, removing evidence of what isn't as it appears, removing evidence of what does not correspond to happiness. Polishing is tied to progression. The more you deny, the walls, the doors, the further you go. When polishing is tied to progression, so much disappears. Polishing means more than smiling for their brochures, although it does mean smiling for their brochures. It also means being willing to gloss over the violence of colonial histories, the very violence that led some of us to be here, the very violence that is present. It means being willing to reproduce that violence. So you damage legacy by not polishing the table, by not being polished yourself, by labouring to reveal what I sometimes call killjoy truths. We show then that what they call reality is the thinnest of veneers. We force their hand. We force their hand. We force their hand out. So I referred earlier to Sarah Franklin's essay on sexism in the academy. She gave that talk at a conference. And when she showed the bloody document on a PowerPoint slide, you could hear the groans and the moans from the audience, the energy and the relief even. It was like a feminist roar. It was so loud. Why? So often you can't quite put a finger on it. Sexism, also racism, even when you come up against it, even when it stops you from doing something or being something. And so it's such a relief to witness collectively that hand, to see it in front of us, what works so often by being invisible. To force their hand is to force the force out so that it can be witnessed. So to see through the veneer of common sense is to see so much more. I'm even going to say it. It is to see reality even, how things materialise, the wear and the tear of coming up against the same thing. That is why what I have called complaint activism, which is part of the conclusion of my book on complaint, is how we might, as it were, queer common sense. Kara Keeling describes queer common sense as how we make what has been imperceptible, perceptible, giving room to what is eccentric, or what she calls eccentric orientations. To suggest complaint activism is a queering of common sense, is to suggest that making some things perceptible, giving room to who as well as what is eccentric, requires labour. The point, of course, is not to perceive things, but to change them. But some things are hard to change because they are not perceived, because they've been polished away, and that's where they stay, which means we have to change things, remove the polish for them to be seen. And that is the work of complaint activism too, removing the polish, getting the work out of its containers. When we complain about the letters in the box, our complaint becomes another letter in the box. One student said her complaint was shoved in the box. Another said her complaint ended up in the complaint graveyard. Complaint activism is also the work of getting these complaints out of the filing cabinet. I'm making an analogy in a way between the filing cabinet and the polished table. The filing cabinet, the place that complaints go to die. When I left my own institution, I leaked information, not very much, but just enough, so that people would know that there had been inquiries into sexual harassment. I was certainly told I damaged legacy, and I was told that primarily by feminist colleagues. One described my various communications as unprofessional. I've been calling myself an unprofessional feminist ever since. Learning what it means to be professional. To be professional is to be willing to keep your institution's secrets, to keep polishing that table so that no one can see what has been going on. Silence then is not something simply enforced by management or marketing departments, although it is. It can also be performed as loyalty or duty by our own colleagues. Sometimes it's those who are closest to us, with whom we share an allegiance, who tell us that we're not doing it right, that we're not polished enough or polite enough. I don't think we're going to get the changes we need by doing it right. The lecturer who described her complaint as a little bird scratching away at something, she left, as I mentioned earlier. She read her resignation letter out. I wrote a 2-page letter, and it was really important to me to put everything in there that I felt, so that it was down on paper. And then I asked for a meeting with the dean. I kind of read the letter out in a performative kind of way, just to have some kind of event. So her complaint then fills the space that she leaves. But she still wanted to do more. She wanted to get her letter on the wall. She said, I just thought, I'm not the kind of person who would put my resignation letter on the wall, but I just wonder what it is that made me feel that I'm not that kind of person, because inside I am that kind of person. I just couldn't quite get it out. So perhaps that's what complaint activism is also about, how we help each other get it out, to get the complaints onto the wall. So sometimes, yes, we get the information out by getting out ourselves, but there are other methods. You can escalate a complaint so it ceases to be handled internally by an organisation, or you can turn formally filed complaints into handouts to pass around to others. We can use our feminist ears to listen out for small sounds, the groans of frustration, little birds scratching away at something, trying to create room for themselves. Scratch, scratch. Sound can build. Sound builds. I hear the shout of feminist recognition when we forced that handout. I hear the sharp sound of Sisters Uncut setting off 1,000 rape alarms to mark the anniversary of the Clapham Common Vigil for Sarah Everard, murdered by a police officer. The police had beaten and arrested many protesters on that day, coming down on those who came out, whose mourning was militancy. I hear the collective primal scream of many outside the houses of the presidents of Columbia University and NYU after they called the police to arrest students protesting for Palestine. Linda, can you hear us now? They asked. We hear them now, and we hear each other fight to be heard. And we might then keep those receipts or find those receipts or send those receipts out. We could follow writer Sara and keep the receipts. Soleil writes about the brutality of the Israel's occupation of Palestine and of the genocide in Gaza, Palestine removed from the map, complaints directed against Palestinian people for speaking out, Palestinian people stopped from speaking out. Soleil ends her piece, every Palestinian I know is forced to become a bookkeeper. One day, our receipts will come in handy. That's the hand we need. Or you can turn the complaint into an occupation. Students where I used to work had made complaints about racism that were ignored. So in 2019, they formed an action group, Goldsmiths Anti-Racist Action, GARA, and occupied Deptford Town Hall, the administrative hub of the university, for 137 days, stopping the university from conducting its business. The management appeared to be listening, to be meeting with the students. Etaraf Datarian and Akansha Mehta, two academics of colour from Goldsmiths, tell us what they were actually doing. Just as GARA was coming to a final agreement with management, it found pinned on the door of Deptford Town Hall a large envelope with over 500 pages of documents charging trespass and filled with social media evidence of GARA's members' involvement in the occupation. Rather than a simple injunction, senior management threatened to prosecute core individuals involved in the occupation if they didn't vacate the building immediately. This was happening at the same time that management appeared to be giving their ear to the students, to listening to their demands. They were collecting evidence, putting them under surveillance. But by turning their complaints into an occupation, these students forced it out, all of those documents out, so we could see it on the fucking door. So you turn your complaints into an occupation, and we know very much that the hands of the institution can come down on those who do that, who force their complaints into an occupation. So I just want to recognise the students here today at Oxford, the encampment, my solidarity to you, forcing the hand, forcing the force out, the hands in pockets, institutional complicity with war and genocide. This is deeply politicising. More can see what we're up against when we get in the way, when we say no to business as usual. But we need to know that the hands of the institution come down hard on those who say no or say it in the wrong way. So we need more to say it, and we need to say it more. So I hear here Audre Lorde. In an interview with Adrian Rich, Audre Lorde describes how she was sickened with fury about the acquittal of a white policeman who had murdered a black child, that she had to stop the car to get her feelings out. And what came out was a poem she called Power. Lorde teaches us that sometimes we have to stop what we are doing to register the impact of violence. In that poem, Lorde uses an image of what poetry is not. Poetry is about not letting our power lie limp and useless as an unconnected wire. Lord uses words like electricity, snap, snap, sizzle, passing that no around so that you and I can pick up that poem and read it. When Lord stopped the car to write a poem about power, she took so much in. The violence of the police, the violence of white supremacy. She took it in to get it out. And I think about now what we need to take in to get out. Words that carry the message, that tell the story of what is happening here, such as those given to us by Rafat al-Hariri, Palestinian writer and poet assassinated by Israel. His poem, If I Must Die, begins, "If I must die, you must live to tell my story." A poem can be the gift of an image. Al-Hariri gives us an image of a piece of cloth and some strings becoming a kite, flying above so that a child in Gaza might see it and think for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. That cloth, those strings, words strung together, becomes a story we must live to keep telling, a hand setting that story free. That too is the hand we need. It is an image of hope and of freedom, and we fight for that hope and freedom, and we do so collectively, and we are carrying the words, Al-Hariri's, also Lord's words, onto the streets, the snap of a slogan, a no, a stop, stopping the car, stopping the cars, that flow of human traffic. Thank you.
So we've got about 30 minutes for questions. Please, if you can, keep your questions short-ish. And afterwards, the English faculty has very kindly provided a huge amount of cake. So please stay and share that with us and have a chat to Sara. Yes.
Hi, so I'm a visiting student. I normally go to Columbia University. So it's been an interesting term to be in Oxford. But one thing I'm thinking about, so at Columbia, every second year has to take a history, Western philosophy course. It's for many years it was kind of as you would expect, all like Plato and Aristotle. One of the things that happened, I believe, in the 70s or 80s is they started adding a number of more contemporary philosophers of color, most notably Francis Fanon's black skins, white masks. And so what I'm kind of thinking about is that one of the things that's interesting about what's happening at Columbia is that ostensibly all of the students protesting have been taught by the university this kind of decolonial manifesto. And that might be one of the reasons why they've been a lot more skeptical of kind of institutional concessions than people say at Brown or other elite American universities. So what I'm thinking of is like, how do we distinguish like real changes in culture or like real victories in the comportments of universities or institutions versus those that are like just window dressing? Because I think that on the one hand, my tendency might be to think that something like adding Fanon to a syllabus is just a diversity move that doesn't mean anything. But at least in our current context, it has seemingly, maybe not minute, but a noticeable effect, or it is helpful in some capacity.
Well, thank you for your question, and it's a really good question. And sometimes it's very, very hard to tell the difference between changes that are about the appearance of change and and those that are actually requiring a modification of what is being done within the institution or what is being done by it. It's very, very difficult to see, and even some changes that seem to be quite substantial can end up not being so after time, because the people who pushed for those changes go, and then the changes seem to go with them. So it's very, very hard to see, and I don't think there's a way of us finding a formula that helps us to tell cosmetic change from real change, and that then means we know what's what. I don't think it will work like that. I do think that there's every reason to be sceptical of how decolonial can be used in a similar way to how diversity has been used, as a way of adding something to a syllabus in order to preserve it rather than to change it. Having said that, I would also say that even cosmetic changes or symbolic changes can have material differences on people. Like I know when I taught my students, admittedly in cultural studies, but I know what difference it made to those students to be able to read the work of Black feminists and revolutionary thinkers, that work can change a person's life, and that person matters. Where they go matters, what they do matters. So even if changing the syllabus doesn't mean we're really addressing the colonial structures of the university, it does still have an impact. And even like some of the forms of sort of symbolic diversity, you know, I'm very quick to be critical of them, as many diversity practitioners themselves are, as I've shown you. But even some of those differences can matter at one level, like having queer flags might make people feel a bit more that they'll be less likely to receive a hostile environment. Maybe that's a problem because there is a hostile environment, and then the queer flag is kind of like working to disguise that hostility. But sometimes not. Sometimes just having signs that you're going to be okay here, that there are other people here who think you're going to be okay, actually does mean it's more likely that you will go there, and then more people go there. There is a gradual, slow, incremental change. I already remember one time when we had an event, it was a trans of colour event at the Centre for Feminist Research at Goldsmith, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I didn't know a university could look like this. Because it wasn't just because there were more brown people, more trans and queer people there, although that kind of matters because, you know, let's face it, it's more interesting when that's the case. But it was also that there was something about the impact of that. It was almost atmospheric. It was a kind of freeing or a lightening that you could almost feel in the atmosphere. So I think, you know, then that implies that even there's no like clear line between sort of the symbolic changes or adding text to the syllabus, or even adding people to the diversity committee. They can be about using the impression of change not to do something. But even those impressions can have effects on real people. And I think that's actually important to remember.
Would you like to take a few questions at a time, or one?
Sure.
Okay.
It's not an answer.
Let's go 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, I want to say thank you so much for those words of the like, just both the solace and the encouragement. Thank you particularly for your solidarity with the Cameron and with Palestinians in general. I was really struck by what you were saying about consensus conservatism, this kind of insistence that like our world's norms are intuitive and are simple, and the left are needlessly complicating these age-old truths. But I was wondering if you also had thoughts about what we might consider its opposite, a sort of obfuscatory conservatism, or sort of it's complicated conservatism. There's this kind of insistence that leftists are sometimes wading into issues far too complicated for them to grasp, and they therefore cannot begin to intervene or complain about. And we talked about this a bit in terms of people being accused of not understanding institutional norms, but I'm thinking, again, particularly about Palestine, and about, let's say, Zadie Smith's recent insistence that the history of Israel-Palestine is too labyrinthine for campus activists to be able to comprehend, and thus that demands of Palestinian liberation and end to genocide in Gaza are fundamentally misguided. So yeah, I was wondering if you had thoughts about that particular strategy of saying not you're overcomplicating, but you're oversimplifying. Yeah.
I really recognise what you're saying. Thank you for that. And I have read the same piece, unfortunately. I think that, common sense conservatism, I was looking at a specific group that call themselves that. And in a way, what I'm trying to sort of do with that critique of their work is not to say, let's critique their work and that's that. Because I also wanted to sort of imply that common sense conservatism is not just a discrete ideology. It also it also sort of moves through the institution, which associates recognizing the institution and its history with progressing within it. And so my argument being really then that those who sort of question what the institution's about are less likely to be moving into the institution in order to be able to change what counts as being in it. So that, I'm sort of interested in the reproductive mechanics of that. So what you were told you need to do to progress further or faster in a system reproduces the system. So that's why I wanted to sort of begin with it as a kind of a discrete ideology, but then move my focus to thinking of it more as world building. But absolutely, I think that, I've always thought that the call for like nuance, that we need a more nuanced perspective, or it's complicated, as a kind of general reaction to things, is about what you're not willing to see, which is how power and force operate in a given situation. And that sometimes you need to say it's not fucking complicated. There is a genocide in Gaza. And I think that being able to make those declarative speech acts becomes very important to counter the ways in which nuance simply means not seeing things as they are. So this is why I haven't worked all this out yet. I'm very early on this project, but this is why I'm not trying to say, I'm not trying to give up the concept of reality to the common sense conservatism. I'm trying to say that actually we're building a picture of reality because we're accounting for what they can and will not perceive in order to preserve their idea of culture as possession. And I think that actually, I absolutely think that there's a way in which there are so many, I think it's called institutional blinds. The image of that was given by the early career scholar who described the institution. She talked about the blinds come down. I use that quite a lot in my book, Complaint, because I think it's quite a helpful way of realising that sometimes the blinds come down because things have been seen. They have actually been seen. The harassment has been seen, the violence has been seen. So the blind is a way of not seeing what has been seen. And I think nuance functions a little bit like an institutional blind. It comes down precisely because actually it has already been seen, and there has been all of these methods for not seeing what people see, and then justifying the positioning of the person who sees it as the one who's imposing violence or imposing interpretation on a situation.
Thank you very much for that excellent talk. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on your, if I may say, your withdrawal from the institution. Because I'm always torn between that position that we must all engage with in our capacities to change the institution from within, but then there's also what I think to be the really powerful role of withdrawing from it. And I'm just curious about your views on the potential sort of conflicts or shared things between those two different positions?
It's a really good question, and it's one I actually do ask myself. But I think it's important to say that that moment of withdrawal, it wasn't really a conscious, worked out plan. It was really far from it. It was much closer to I can't do this anymore. And when I realized I couldn't do it anymore, the work that I was doing at that institution, I was like, I don't know if I can go somewhere else, because I don't know if I want to go somewhere else and find out about all the shit. Like, at least I know the shit here, but I don't want to go and find out, through this whole process of coming to this new shit that I had yet to discover. So I'm like, okay, I'm not, and obviously I could only do that. Like, I had to know that there was an alternative route possible for me, but it was still a bit of a risk. I mean, my mum was like, oh, Sara, really? Really? Permanent job, really? But it was a risk, but I knew I wanted to be a writer. Also, because I think partly the impact of going through the complaint process is what led me to want to actually really listen to complaint. And I was really only able to do the work that collect these really incredible testimonies. So I'm thinking with all the time, they're in my voice, like the people I spoke to, they're in my head. They're very good company. I couldn't do that if I was still in the institution, I don't think. I think I needed to be somewhere else, to be a place that people could bring their complaints. So in my case, I feel that withdrawing has given me more of an opportunity to do the kind of institutional critique that I wanted to do. But that's just that particular scenario. And I think, I think the conversations I had with diversity practitioners back in the early 2000s really taught me that there are lots of different tools and strategies for doing this work, and that some of the people that don't look like they're doing the work of institutional critique, maybe they just look like they're being the administrator towing the line, that some of the stories in the complaint research show that. For example, one disabled student talked about how she was getting nowhere with her complaint about the failure to provide reasonable accommodations, and then this file appears on the student union's fax machine. And she said to me, it was after a very hard meeting, she said, I think one of the secretaries pulled the file out. The secretary, the keeper of secrets, the secretary knows where the files are. They know what to do to get them out. And so there's a way in which the administrator, who actually probably more than anyone else witnesses how institutions come down on people who complain, it also knows what to do, what sabotage to do to get the letters out that allow that student to have company. So there's lots of different actions that are possible both within and without institutions.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk and for your scholarship. Thank you to Chris and the rest of the women's activities for organising this. I'm a proud graduate of the Master's as well, and I'm currently doing my PhD here, and I look at activism by women of colour at Oxford. And my question is about hope and cynicism and kind of the lack of hope. And I think I draw a lot of hope from my participants and the testimonies that they've given me, but I think being mired in the kind of institutional work and the institution itself, and doing work that criticizes the institution, I find it very easy to fall into cynicism. So I was wondering if you could share any of your experiences about working in institutions, being bogged down by perhaps the negativity and all of these stories that you have heard and witnessed, and how is there a way to reconcile that other than leaving the institution?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's ambivalent. Sometimes when I'm doing the kind of work of really confronting institutional violence, particularly the work of complaint, I do feel despondent. I have felt despondent, as if to say, what is the use? Because even if there's change, it will just be the appearance of change. But when I think about it, really, when I did the research and complaint, and I was going through the process of leaving my job, and there's a lot of grief attached to that. I really loved being an academic and loved the work I had done there, and loved my students, and loved being a feminist with other feminists within the institution. But when I listened to people who talked about things that had happened to them that led them to complain, and then also what happened when they had complained, it is really heavy, hard stories of trauma and violence being escalated. The violence that led you to complain being escalated because you did. But I wasn't left the way I was when I did the diversity research, feeling so low. It was really, really interesting. It was actually, if anything, the most hopeful work I've done, because I think it was because I really got a sense of people about how much they were going to fight. They were going to fight for their jobs even, fight for other people who might come after them as well. That sense of this is a fight, and I'm going to do what I can. So even when there was a story of not getting through, having to leave that post or that program, there was just something I remember an Indigenous student who, made a complaint about white supremacy at the university. It's not going to go down well on the university to make that complaint. So she mainly did her PhD on campus, but then she said that, and she used this expression twice, an unexpected little gift was that other students knew she was there and could reach out to her. And there's something about that, the fight leading to a kind of communication, almost an intergenerational communication. And I feel like that when I come into universities, though I'm not working at one, and I see what students are doing, and I see the protests, and I see the encampments, and you have that sense actually, not of just being weighed down by the impossibility of changing history or changing institutions, but of the fight being kept alive. And I think that is hopeful, a weary hope perhaps, but hope nevertheless.
Take another 3 questions. Maybe from the back one, over here, 2, and 3.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate it, and thank you as well for the kind of verbal expression of solidarity with the encampment and Palestine. My question is to do with your phrase complaint activism, which I thought was a really fascinating kind of conceptualization. And I suppose what I'm wondering about is almost the opposite of that, the weaponization of the systems of complaint by hegemony, the weaponization of white fragility, for example. the use of complaint to create a hostile environment that then further marginalizes people who are already marginalized, thinking specifically in relation to the encampments and to like the debates that have raged around them. I recently came across a video of a right-wing activist walking around the encampment, essentially trying to bait students into debating with them. And when all of them singularly directed this activist to their media representative, got incredibly emotional and upset that nobody was being baited, essentially, and raised a complaint about that. Why is nobody debating me? And so I was just wondering what you think about that almost hegemonic form of complaint and how complaint activism can be used to maybe excavate spaces of solidarity from within that.
We'll take 3 in a row, so second question here.
Is this volume okay, or should I speak a bit louder?
That's good.
First of all, thank you very much for your work as a specific person. Second of all, I think there are connections between clear common sense, what's uncommon, and uncommon, specifically referring to the work of Professors Humanities and Organised. So I kind of threw from that and kind of the stuff that has been happening in particular Sara or New Zealand. I was wondering whether you could kind of talk further about how complaint about the institution can be weaponized by the institution as a further form of their false positives and sort of act against this.
Could you repeat just the last bit of your question? Yes, and loud.
Sorry.
Sorry.
So, could you talk further about how complaint about the institution can be weaponized by the institution as a further form of, as you said, false positives, but also ultimately how to act against this?
Could you hear that at the back? Yeah, okay. And the third question was here.
Thanks so much. I've been reading a writer called Gerard O'Toole on geopolitical strategies, and he suggests that common sense is a cultural storehouse. There's cultural storehouses which offer building blocks for storylines. And I wondered about if you could say some things about neutrality, which seems to me this kind of neutrality within cultural institutions, which seems to be a certain quite vicious form with a super racist history, but of vague washing, and somehow, and how it might relate to common sense in that same way of how that is built up. I sort of feel that specificity is a kind of answer to neutrality. I wonder if there were other ways that you would find it.
Thank you all for the questions. And yeah, I mean, I introduced the term common sense. I didn't introduce that term, it has a long history. I introduced the term complaint activism in my book, Complaint. And it came to me as a term when I was actually listening to the disabled student I mentioned, her story with the secretary pulling out the file. It was in response to her that I introduced that term, because she was telling me about how she, as a disabled disability justice activist, would use complaints and help other people make complaints in the courts as well as within institutions. And the way she talked about complaint, it was really like a kind of like pushing against the institution, because it's kind of like a way in which you're channeled away from complaint. So you keep complaining as part of resistance to that channeling away. And she was just talking about it, and I'm like, that sounds like complaint activism. And so I said, you know, do you call yourself a complaint activist? It's not supposed to do it research, you're not supposed to put words in people's mouths, of course. And she's like, yeah, no, that's what I do. And so that's how that worked. And so when I think about that, I'm like, the word came from somebody else. It didn't come from me. It came from listening to somebody else talk about their work. But by complaint activism, I don't mean that complaints are necessarily progressive or that they're always used to counter institutional violence or histories of hostility or inequalities. Absolutely, complaints can be weaponized against minority communities. They can be taken more seriously if the person who's complaining has money. It can be taken more seriously if the person is a stakeholder in an organization. If you're taken more seriously, you might not need to complain. But if you're not taken more seriously and you complain, your complaint will be taken more seriously. So I think it's important we don't neutralise complaints, because you don't need to complain about not being able to get in the building if access isn't a problem for you. So some people are going to need to complain because of the ways in which buildings are structured. But nevertheless, those who don't need to complain can still use complaints in order to further all sorts of causes, and use complaints in a similar way that I've described, that incite other people to complain, for example, is an example of complaint activism that can be used against all sorts of people in really problematic ways. So that, I think it's a very important part of the story, that whenever we're talking about anything that we're introducing to try and change something, that doesn't belong to us. That's not only what we do, other people can do that, and even we, it's not clear, like it's not that here we are and there they are. We're all in complicated relationships to these institutions, and the methods that we introduce to try and make changes here can be also used very differently by a different population in ways that we don't recognise. This is a bit of a distraction, but I just remember this story shared with me by a woman of colour about a sexual harasser who had a feminist killjoy on his door. And when she said that she found it problematic that he had figured the feminist killjoy on his door, he filed a complaint against her. So yeah, like our work can end that on the door. And that's also a little bit of an answer to that question. That I know I'm very aware about how my own work even on complaint can be used by institutions to create the impression that they're listening. I remember one time I was at an institution, not in this country, and I was talking about nodding as a non-performative, and then doing nothing. And the senior managers of the institution, the most sort of powerful professors, were at the front. Students were at the back, and students were going through this complaint, and they were saying, a lot of the things that were happening at that institution were the things I was describing, and they were saying, Sara, did you notice that they were all nodding when you were talking about nodding? And because they could nod in recognition of the non-performative nod while enacting it. So yeah, absolutely, I do think it's important to talk about that. That's why it's like we do not transcend the problems we describe, we're in them. And it's very, very important to describe that. On stories and common sense and neutrality, I think I'm really interested in thinking about common sense, not just as a history of an idea, but different stories about common sense and what it's used. And I'm actually I really quite like some of the work in anthropology on common sense as a system, the Goetz's piece on common sense as a system, and thinking about neutrality. I think, I don't really know if I have a really good answer to that question, but I think that, there's a kind of there's a common sense view of common sense, and I think partly what we're looking at is critiquing the common sense view of common sense, and that means having other stories or putting other stories out there about what common sense might mean for this group or that group or for this institution or that institution, where things like objectivity, neutrality, subjectivity, they all might acquire different value and meaning. But I like the idea, I think of myself as telling stories. I began with the sentence, I've been listening to people who have been telling stories about trying to change institutions. So in a way, I kind of like the idea of thinking about common sense as another story I'm listening to, which is why I wanted to put it along with complaint as a different kind of lesson and legacy on the same objects, but from a different vantage points.
We're all three.
Yeah, okay, that can be.
Okay. Yes, and two. Is there another person? Okay.
Yes, Sara. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you and seeing you in person. In strange encounters, you discuss social implications of being a stranger and how strangers stand out in what community
hearing the encampment. I'm curious, because I'm very taken by this conception of complaint activism, if you could perhaps talk about how complaints become demands in some sense, like, because of course we talk about like social movements and activism and things like encampments, and frequently, you know, when people come together for these things, they're usually oriented around a set of demands. And I guess, and also I'd be welcome for you to sort of criticize this framing, but I almost have a sense of like complaint as a sort of individual manifestation of like the way that each of us are like implicated in and like affected by these institutions and systems, and sort of complaints are like expressions of how we individually experience them acting on us, but that demands are sort of like collective coming together of like many people's complaints, sort of like you could say democratically or reflectively or processually, discursively, like coming into sort of single statements that are also acts. So yeah, I guess the process by which that actually occurs, I'm curious if you have any like, thoughts about that, or perhaps like this very framing of complaints and demands as being on a different level is perhaps like problematic to begin with. I don't know. But
well, thank you all for all your questions. I really appreciate them, and for taking the time to be here in a room without windows on a sunny day. It's a lot. I'm really so grateful for the time that you've given. It's interesting to go back to Strange Encounters. I mean, that came out in 2000, and it seems such a long time ago, but actually, you know, the writing about the stranger in that book was really sort of intellectually significant for me, because it set me on a path towards thinking about emotions differently, and it took me towards phenomenology, and I was very interested in the stranger as somebody you recognise as familiar, so countering the kind of the literatures of stranger danger, which tell you that the stranger is someone you don't know, to think about how the stranger is already known. And I think there's a way in which Derrida's work on hospitality is profoundly relevant to that. And in a way, more recently, when I was doing the work on emotion and then doing work on institutions, I began to think about hospitality as part of how institutions work, because they create this impression that there are certain people who are here first, who are then welcoming the others who come in or don't come in, who have to be grateful, to return to your introduction, for the good fortune of their arrival. So for me, thinking about kind of institutions as a kind of conditional hospitality rather than unconditional hospitality has been a really useful way of thinking about how even the positive gestures of saying, come in, can be a means by which you say certain people don't belong in the institution in the same way. Policy, I mean, it's a really good question. I'm actually really interested in policy and policy formation, not to get at the national level. I've been working very much within sort of organisational levels, but I was really surprised when I did the work on complaint how many people talked about policy. They talked about policies, and partly because when you complain, you have to find out what the policies are, because you have to refer to them. So you end up knowing a lot about the policies, and then you realise that knowing about the policies and showing that the policies haven't done something or aren't working isn't sufficient evidence to support your case. So you begin to understand that the policies that exist don't necessarily get operationalised. But I was also really interested in how we had ended up where I was working, having a long, conversation about how to change the policies because they were deeply inadequate. And I was very aware that institutions can change a policy without changing the culture. And if that's the case, you can change policy in order to not change the culture. But nevertheless, we needed the policy to change, because unless it changed, the students couldn't say, well, actually, this conduct is wrong. So I began to think then about, well, what would be a way of thinking about a good way of making policy changes? So it's not at the level of the national policy formation, but for me then, what I learned from talking to people was that actually the best way of changing policy is to have a conversation about why you need to do so. And actually often when there's a crisis in an organisation and there's like a public relations concern, oh my gosh, there's sexual harassment in this institution or racial harassment in this institution, people will use policy to sort of solve the problem precisely by not actually talking about the problem that the policy is intended to address. So what you need to have is a conversation about the need for new policies that's in reference to the problems that the people who are having the problems will tell you about. So you need to involve the people, the communities who are implicated in the injustices or inequalities that the policies are needed to address. And that's really, for me, what I would say would be my just intuitive thought on that. Yeah, I think one of the findings from doing this research on complaint, and by findings I mean a place I ended up that was unexpected, was how significant collectivity was. So many people gave me stories of making a complaint, going through a long, arduous process, and then not getting anywhere, and ending up feeling quite isolated or just basically stuck. The stories where I really learned that people had a sense that actually their complaint got somewhere. They didn't necessarily get what they wanted from it, but they got something out of it was when they worked as a group. So I began to call those groups complaint collectives, how you work together to formulate a set of demands, actually. So I think the two can be related. Like, you can do a collective complaint in such a way that you are working out what your demands are, because in a way your demands are also a diagnosis of what the problems are. And when the students I've talked to who worked as groups to address institutional violence have spent a lot of time sharing experiences about things that have happened. So you're documenting the problem collectively in order then to shift or transition from that diagnosis of the problem to something that is about saying, well, this is what we want or need to move forward. So I think you can make distinctions between protests, complaints, and demands if you want to. I've never tended to make arguments by using or creating distinctions between things, because I sometimes think that if your distinctions are clear in your intellectual work, but they're not clear in everyday life, then your intellectual work has got you further away from everyday life rather than closer. But I really like to hear about how people are doing what they're doing. Like, that's kind of the almost became a sociologist, I think, in that moment. And I'm really interested in how people do that work, where they're thrown together, there's a crisis, they're thrown together, and they need to work out how are we going to combine our forces? Because you have to combine forces to get through certain very intractable institutional injustices. You have to work together. And it's the working out. I think that's a really important part of politics. It's not just a means to an end. Actually, when you're involved in collective politics, the process of collecting together and being together and working out who you are and what you're doing, that is so important. And it's energetic, and it's animating, and it is actually full of hope and love and dance and friendship, as well as a willingness to say no to the forms of violence that make life, worlds impossible for so many. Are there any more? A couple more.
Okay.
I'll be short.
1, 2, 3, all in general.
Yeah, I'm someone who's worked most of my life in the not-for-profit sector, and like you, more or less left my sector because I came to that my experience. It's quite a good segue from the last question. In the not-for-profit sector, people come to I mean, workers are very unprotected, but people come particularly isolating, unprotected, because often we're the only person in the organisation. And my observation is that there's often a suite of policies and declarations about values-based organisations, and we're anti-racist, we're anti-this, we're anti-that. So that actually, when you raise an issue, not necessarily with complaints, the response is maybe even more vicious. And the first point of viciousness is a whole long period of total inaction, stasis, while they recover from the blow that you just dealt with the body of the organisation by saying something's not quite right and that you don't love it.
as well formed as other ones or as eloquent, but something that I was thinking about is at times when I've complained about things, it's usually to white people. These are the people that are in the positions that handle complaints, and sometimes it's white men, and I feel like I'm playing into this trope of white saviorism, kind of feeding this ego, and it's kind of like, oh, you poor, pitiful black woman, tell me about how we've kind of oppressed you, and it's kind of this perverted, sick, white supremacy kind of fantasy when you sometimes make these complaints. And yeah, I guess my question is, where does this kind of performance meet with authenticity, and how can people that are people of color, I guess, make these complaints? I guess while still having to play into this kind of white savior performance that seems like you can't really, I just don't know how to fight against that. I have to make a complaint to a white man about something like this. It seems like I can't break that. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. Sorry, it's a bit long, but
Thank you so much for coming also, and I really enjoyed it. Whilst I really recognize the power of collective politics, I wanted to ask you a question about the history of complaint within different communities. So complaints against discrimination and hegemonic power has different histories within and across different communities. For example, as women of color, we know that especially for Black women, the history of complaining is very much tied to the violence inflicted and experienced by them. And so I wanted to ask, if we were to kind of construct an activism around complaint, how do we reconcile that with these historical specificities, especially for particular groups within institutions, like for example, being here and having been supervised by a Black female professor. You know, that has been almost a protective action. We have to say, come complain to me. You know, complaint functions differently for us. And so I wondered how that was reflected.
Thank you again for three really important questions. Observations about money, yes. I think one of the things I really noticed when I was talking to people, the study that I did was complaints at universities, although more recently I've been trying to think about how that relates to other workplaces. But one of the things I really noticed was the use of bribery, that a lot of people are stopped by being warned that to complain would be to compromise their careers or their personhood in some way. They're just dissuaded from complaining by being told all the bad things that will happen if they do, or they're dissuaded by being told that they will be creating evidence that they don't belong in the institution, so that you need to really not complain in order to create evidence you do belong. It's kind of funny dynamic there. But I did also hear the opening quote about the yes, the management as a yes technique. Yes technique as a management. Yes saying as a management technique. Finally got it out. It is along that direction. So this is kind of like the yes that somebody might say because it has nothing behind it, but you're sort of encouraged to complain and then nothing happens. But there's also bribery, which is being incentivized not to complain, has a very important role across many different institutions, partly because bribery unofficially is part of the non-disclosure agreement system, that in return for the settlement you'll be silent, but you'll get X or Y, money or other kinds of assets. And one story I really remember, it's not an interview-based story, but it was a woman of colour. She was wanting to complain, she made a complaint about racial harassment at her institution, and she wanted to tell her story. It wasn't painting or writing, she just wanted to be able to go out there and share her story wherever it was. But the university said that they would give her a sabbatical if she signed an NDA. And she really needed that sabbatical because the process of complaining about racial harassment, you can imagine, was the experience of an intensification of the harassment she complained about. So what the institution could give her was what she needed because of what it had taken from her. And so she took the NDA. She can't speak about it, but she got the sabbatical. So I think that they're the kind of things that I really notice. And whether it's money as such, where it's just giving you an incentive not to pursue something in another way, like not to speak out loudly about your complaint or not to take it to an ombudsman or something like that. Stephanie. Oh, yes, I think it's to complain about a racist organisation is to complain to one. And I think a lot of us have a consciousness of who we would be complaining to, and a lot of that consciousness of who we'd be complaining to is another reason not to complain. I really remember an interview I did with a black queer woman. She's a professor, and she had a really bad racist incident with a white woman colleague, but she said to me she decided not to make a complaint because she said, Sara, you know, the complaints is just PR for the institution. She knew what complaints would do and what it wouldn't do. That it would just be, you know, a cover up basically. But in the end she did make a complaint. So why? She made a complaint because another person, a man of colour, made a complaint about racism from the same department. And so she ended up making a complaint because she wanted to participate to support his complaint. So she actually said to me, I didn't even make the complaint internally even. So she hadn't even internally recognised what had happened because it was just too much to take in or take on. But once he said that he was going to make a complaint, it brought her complaint out with it. And that's the thing about that. I mean, it's not really an answer to your question, but it kind of sort of implies to me that really, when the two is the problem, who we're delivering the complaint to, we need other people. It might be that it's the other people who are complaining and we join them, or it might be that we just redirect our complaints, not necessarily to the institution, but to others who share our history in relationship to that institution. But yeah, it's a dilemma. I mean, a lot of the stories that were shared with me about complaint are not about a complaint as a resolution to a problem, but a complaint as a problem in another form. But yes, I think it's so important to think about the different histories around complaint. And I think as soon as you sort of pull out a word and you follow it around, you're always at risk of somehow not attending to some of those specificities that really do matter. I think one of the experiences that I had doing the research, when thinking about the university, of all sorts of differences represented in the people who are speaking to you, and in a way, people who are speaking to me about their experience of complaint, they're not just any people. They're the people who found out that I was doing this research. So they're people who knew enough to know that I, feminist of colour, was doing this research, and that one of my starting points was the consideration of sexual harassment in British universities. So that probably meant that I was speaking to certain people more than other people. But as word got round, people came to me. It's like part of what I think about being a feminist here. You're saying I'll be a place that will receive your complaint. So I began to get complaints from elsewhere. And I'm well aware that my work is not ever going to be adequate to address all of the histories that people bring to me when they come to me with their story. And yeah, what I was really struck when I think about the book Complaint involves complaints from many different countries, even though the focus was the UK, was how much resonance there was across different stories. And I think one of the things that I would say, I mean, that doesn't allow the importance of specificity at all. It's another way that specificity matters, I suspect. One of the things that I really noticed was how much it was about, the experience of complaint was about registering yourself as not being part of the institution. The institution was not for you, even though maybe it said it was, or that there was room for you. And that some of the complaints about disability, discrimination, and inaccessible institutions ended up having a really pivotal role in my theorisation of thinking about how racism, racial harassment, and sexual harassment work institutionally. So I think what I was getting was lots of different perspectives on the problem of how institutions appear to be open but are closed by virtue of many histories, sometimes explicitly written down as rules of conduct, what you're supposed to say and do, but often not written down at all. Just these very invisible histories that we come up against and we don't know the rules, and that we often experience as pushing us out. And I think when I'm running a complainant's handbook, I'm trying to push the stories out of the university a little bit more. So it's not really, this is a problem with the university.
well, it is a problem with the university, but it's not just a problem with the university. A lot of people said to me, Sara, like, you could be talking about health sector, you could be talking about government, you could be talking about, you know, and that's right. So I want to think about, like, okay, it's not a thread that simply you can pull and we're all going to be recognising the same thing going on, because we have very many different histories that affect our relationship to institutions. But if you pull the sort of complaint out of a specific workplace and you just have these conversations that interest me, like where do complaints go, where can we go with them, and what kind of conversations can we have about the complaints that we have but don't always make. Because the other thing that I really want to say is that I'm not just talking about formal complaints. And I'm really interested in the ways in which we might express our complaints by not using the institution's forms, because there's really good reasons not to talk to the white man in the complaints office. So people then express their complaints in other ways. And I heard people who talked about going, ah, in the middle of a meeting. That's the complaint. Suddenly you can find out something's happening. Or the people that have talked to me, written to me, I'm going to include some of this in the complaints handbook, talk to me about not getting anywhere in their complaints about racism in museums. And she turned her complaints into songs. And she sang them. And she sent me I can't, it's in Danish, so I can't hear the content of the words, but I could hear the sound. And she said she wanted to convey the quality of the monotony, the dreariness of the work in the sound. So she expressed her complaint in another way to an audience that we become. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about, the creativity that goes on in the different ways that we can put our complaints out there in order to reach each other, with each other having so many different histories that matter.
I think it's a huge amount of questions. Shall we move them to individually outside?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Please join us for some cake outside and join me in thank you.